Hey, we're live here at the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle. 4 days of programming, innovators, policymakers, entrepreneurs, artists, activists, musicians. Everybody's here. The energy is high. It's something we talk about a lot, not just here at the Bloomberg Green Festival, is energy generation. Where energy comes from in the US, about 60% of all of our energy comes from fossil fuels, mostly coal and natural gas. Only around a fifth of energy comes from renewable sources such as wind, hydropower, and solar.
So how is that mix poised to shift? That's something we think a lot about. Why aren't we generating more from renewables? Also a good question. And is there actually money in renewables?
Okay, these are all questions I know our next guest can answer. Rob Barnett is Senior Energy and Commodities Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Jenny Chase is Lead Solar Analyst for Bloomberg NEF. Both join us here at the Bloomberg Green Festival in Seattle. Rob, Jenny, welcome. How are you guys?
Doing great. Enjoying the event.
Good.
Energy's great today.
The energy is great. Gene McCarthy said as long as the energy is clean, it's all good.
Exactly. Good point.
So I want to talk a little bit about just the mix of energy. We heard from Jim Coulter a little earlier, who basically said it's so much simpler to harness the energy from the sun than describing the process of getting carbons from in the ground. Rob, why is such a small mix of U.S. energy production coming from solar?
Well, you know, it is interesting. I would note just the latest EIA data actually shows that wind energy outstripped coal in the latest month. So we're generating more from wind than from coal right now. And so
but not more from fossil fuels. That's just coal.
Just coal.
Is that because there's more wind or less coal?
There's a lot less coal.
Sorry, Rob.
And a lot
we rain on parades.
Gas.
That's what we do. We just rain on parades. Sorry.
But it is growing very fast from a small base. So you know, if we had this conversation in 10 years' time, I think probably the opposite of what you just described will be true.
So Jenny, I am curious, like I grew up and I remember the solar panels that were put on homes, the brand new homes, it was really cool. This is a long time ago, several decades. They never sold. When they finally sold, the solar panels were taken off. We're in a different environment. Have the tipping point in terms of renewables, are we there
Oh
yet?
yes, I mean, what's happened over the last 20 years, which is roughly my career in this industry, is solar panels have got super cheap. I mean, when I started, you'd pay $6 a watt being a standard measure of a solar panel. And today in the US, you pay about 30 cents per watt. And in Europe, you pay 10 cents a watt, by the way, because we don't have all these trade tariffs on imports. So basically, these things have got so cheap that it makes a lot more sense. It's a lot less investment to put them up.
Not cheap enough, though, at least for me in the U.S. And that's something we struggle with. I mean, my electric bill is pretty high, but Jenny, if I get solar, it would take about 8 years to pay for it on my current home.
Depends what state you're in and what incentives.
We're in New York. Yeah, is this all about incentives?
I think at the moment in New York, but it's also. That's actually kind of circular. You know that Americans actually pay about 50% more for their home solar systems than your typical German does. And I think that's a skill issue, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah. So it's partly that you can charge that much because the incentives in New York are incredibly high. I mean, 8 years is actually what we normally say is about what makes residential solar consumers consume.
Okay.
And that does mean that your installers don't have an incentive to cut their costs that much. There's also a lot of paperwork, a lot of regulations that should...
Shocking.
Exactly. I mean...
The modules are the cheap bit. 10 cents a watt. It's the guys up on the ladders on your roof that's where the real cost is at. And it's hard to crunch the labor component of the cost of putting panels on your roof.
It's also paperwork and regulation, especially in states like New York.
Lawyers, things like that.
So how do we shift? How do we change? So is it that we've got to just make it easier? Take the paperwork out? What is it?
I think that would actually really help if the local and federal governments could work together to strip out some of these restrictions to planning permission.
What are they worried about? Gas comes into my home and I don't know, we seem to be doing just fine.
Well, there are some safety issues, there are some appearance issues. I mean, I don't care what my roof looks like, but some people do. And a lot of regulations that were probably originally set up to protect people that don't really apply because it's relatively difficult to hurt yourself with a solar panel.
Rob,
you can do it, but you've got to be trying.
Rob, how much could the cost of solar decrease with regulatory changes? Like, can you give us an idea of a really light touch regulatory state in the U.S. where the installing solar would be so much cheaper?
Well, Jenny knows the stats better than I do, but Germany, let's say, is around a little over $2 a watt. U.S. is closer to $3 a watt to get it all in on your roof. And so Germany is probably the sort of region to look at and sort of say, what do they do? But what I would sort of conclude in an optimistic way is that only about 4% of households in the U.S. have solar right now, so the runway is still massive. A lot of opportunity, and a lot of states are really pushing this concept.
I will tell you, it is. Maybe that's in the U.S., but in California, how high is that number?
It's much higher. I
It
don't know
seems
this
massive.
California stat off
You
my
drive
head.
around California, and it's like every new development has solar.
But the interesting thing about California is it's not just solar these days, it's solar plus batteries.
Yeah.
So California changed its policy and said, look, if you want the really generous subsidy, you can't just do panels on the roof, you also have to do battery storage.
So
California gets about 25% of its electricity from solar. And in my 20 years as a solar analyst, I've learned that when the sun goes down, they stop generating. And that is a real issue.
it's funny how
It
that
only took
works.
20 years. I love
So
that.
can solar ultimately go everywhere or no?
Yes, but there's not much point. Because at a certain point, you're generating in the middle of the day when you already have lots of electricity. And batteries can do some shifting of that.
Right.
But there are limits to how much you can shift with batteries economically. So I think that in the vast majority of places around the world, the limiting factor to how much electricity solar can supply is not space, not land. It is how much you actually need and you can usefully use in the middle of the day.
Yeah. It's going to be a portfolio. There's no solution that's solar only probably. It's going to be wind and perhaps
grids.
nuclear or perhaps hydrogen,
let's
other
go there.
kind of technologies.
You said the P word, portfolio, which really kind of wakes up and perks, all of the Bloomberg audience. So talk to us about the portfolio and where investors need to be kind of thinking about having conversations. Walk us through that portfolio. And Tim and I, we've talked a lot about nuclear. It's amazing how it's kind of back in the conversations, not just Bill Gates, but even before that over the last couple of years.
Well, one thing that's challenging about nuclear is it's really difficult to invest in. So it's sort of a venture capital kind of private equity stage. There aren't great listed companies that you can really gain exposure to that theme. On the wind and solar space, there's a number of companies out there, but it's been a tough couple of years.
It's been brutal.
Right.
Tough is one way to describe it. I mean, a bloodbath is another way to describe it.
Why is it going to get worse?
Okay, so
It's not just rates. Is it all rates?
Oh no, I mean, I don't know what companies you're talking about exactly, but there's the ones that install, and they're going to be under pressure because fundamentally there are negative economies of scale in the installation business. I mean, one reason Germany is cheaper for solar installations is that you don't go to a national chain in Germany. You call up your local plumber or electrician who also does solar modules, and they will put solar modules on your roof, and they have no marketing costs because they literally just put the number on the van. I mean,
Wild, yeah, so different.
it's a very different structure, and partly the US tax incentives are so complicated that it drives these national firms. And then the other sort of stocks you've got in solar are manufacturing stocks, and solar manufacturing is just a horrible business to be in.
Unless you're protected by the Inflation Reduction Act and U.S. tariffs. So the one counter example that I can give for Jenny's thesis on module manufacturing being a tough business
guys should do a roadshow,
is
by the
for
way.
solar.
You guys should do a couple panels together. Oh, you are doing a couple panels. Okay.
Anyway,
So check out First Solar. They are, right now they're running at a 45% gross margin business. But if you were to get rid of the IRA, that dropped to around 20%. So, we are paying more for solar in the US, but there are companies that are actually benefiting from that. So, if you're agnostic on how the company generates its profits, you can look at companies that are protected by the IRA.
Well, one company.
What about other options? Is there other like we talk about wind, we talk about solar, we talk about nuclear. What else is going on there in either R&D? Is there stuff? I think about hydrogen. I thought.
So Jenny, I think
Fusion,
already sort of
yeah.
mentioned this sort of batteries are a big theme, and so if you look at the residential developers that we have in the U.S., we've got three really big ones: Sunnova, Sunrun, and SunPower, and they're approaching the point where about 50% of their customers, our new customers, are adding a battery alongside storage. So thematically, I think battery solar combo is going to be a big hit over the next couple of years. But that's not going to get you all the way to net zero. You are going to need some of these bigger technologies. There's a lot about enhanced geothermal these days, even that's very interesting happening
Right.
in the marketplace.
You're also going to need to build a transmission grid. I mean, in the US, you've got a whole country, just one country, and you have more isolated grids than we have in
She
Europe.
hates on
which
the
is
US
like
a
It's okay.
34
It's okay.
Countries. I mean,
We'll send you on a grand tour, and you can see how bad things are.
but the thing about these
But you're not wrong.
these regions not being connected is also that you can have negative power prices in one region, and then right next door you can have really high power prices.
Right.
And if you built a line between them, that would actually really help increase the amount of clean energy in the mix.
The reason I say how bad things are, I'm referring to Texas's grid,
That's
for
what I was thinking,
example. And
Texas.
also California has an issue where, it gets a really bad rap because the regulators ask people to plug in their electric cars at certain times of the day to reduce demand on the grid. So, in other words, it's a mess.
Mind you, that's quite a rational thing to do. I mean, if you've got these massive great batteries charging around, you kind of want to pay people to use them to support the grid.
Something that came up earlier, we have to, really quickly, should consumers have to pay for carbon? Is that how we change activities? Really quickly.
Yes, but indirectly, through higher prices for the activities that are high carbon emission.
People really hate price signals, so in some sense, the IRA is a backdoor way of getting to the same solution.
All right, we will see. Rob Barnett, thank you so much. Senior Energy and Commodities Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Jenny Chase, Lead Solar Analyst for Bloomberg NEF. You guys, thank you so much. That was a lot of fun.